Hi, I'm Dana Stevens. I'm Slate's movie critic.
And I'm Ross Douthat. My day job is as an editor at The Atlantic, but I'm here for my night job, which is the film critic for National Review. And we're going to be doing a special, I guess, summer blockbuster edition of Blogging Heads, where we talk about some of the big summer movies.
Yeah, and Ross, I don't know you. We've never met. We've had some polemical exchanges in print before, but I have no idea what you think about any of these movies, so I'm good to go. Very curious.
That's good, and that's the thing with National Review. The movie reviews don't go online, so I've actually read your reviews of some of these movies, but so I have the advantage on you, I guess, in that sense. But why don't we start? We've got the two big movies of the weekend are The Hulk and M. Night Shyamalan's The Happening. And The Hulk is, of course, it's not really a remake, it's not really a sequel, it's sort of a hybrid of the Hulk movie that came out only 5 years ago. And I guess I find this a pretty disquieting phenomenon because I'm kind of a skeptic about what I think is... I guess I think we have sort of a superhero glut right about now in summer movies.
I'm afraid we're going to have to agree on that. I mean, I wish I could take you to the mat right off the bat on something, but yeah, the superhero glut is really kind of getting to me. I've got some severe superhero fatigue, and they're going to have to whip out a really amazing Dark Knight for me to not glaze over during that one.
Well, the thing is, I mean, I feel like I'm sort of right in what's supposed to be the target demographic for these kind of movies, which is to say, you know, I like summer movies generally. I like blockbusters. I'm a 20-something male.
Did you read comic books growing up?
Well, I didn't really read comic books growing up. That's the thing. But I was the kind of person who would read comic books. I was, a high school dork, and my friends read comic books, and I was much more of a sort of, J.R.R. Tolkien kind of dork, but usually there's a big overlap. That still
falls within the purview, though. No, that still falls within the general purview of the superhero demo.
Yeah. So, but I guess my sense with these movies, for me, the tipping point actually was Iron Man, which came out about a month ago, and one of the reasons it was a tipping point for me was because it was actually a very good superhero movie. I thought it was sort of a good example of things the genre does well. And I sat through the movie and I thought, this is a very good movie. This was very well done within the limits of the form, and I'm still sick of it. And this was the first of what promised to be, a full. We had Iron Man, we have the Hulk. We have The Dark Knight, and then we have sort of pseudo comic book movies. We've got the Hellboy sequel from Guillermo del Toro coming out.
Why is that a pseudo? That was a real comic book, wasn't it?
Well, yeah, right. It's not pseudo, right? All right. The only pseudo.
You
one
mean lesser?
Is,
he's just a lesser. He's a lesser figure, I guess, in the comic book universe. Not that I would know.
Well, I think that my understanding, and yeah, really for this to work, we should have a diehard comic book aficionado. But yeah, there are sort of levels. But the Hellboy. The figure of Hellboy is sort of he's sort of low end in terms of fame, but high end in terms of sort of the highbrow, lowbrow run. So if you're a highbrow comics fan, you probably like Hellboy a lot more than you like, say, I don't know, Fantastic Four or something. But probably the commenters can write in and
that would make
correct.
Sense with the casting of Ron Perlman, who's obviously a more offbeat and much lesser known actor, but who I actually have always loved as an actor. So I'm looking forward to that one, along with Del Toro. I think that seems like a pretty interesting package. But the question aside for the moment of which of these movies are good and which aren't, although I do want to talk about that, what is the deal with the superhero archetype? I mean, why has that become our myth of the moment for the last 25 years or something? Do you have any kind of cultural take on that?
Yeah, longer than that. I mean, I don't know. I have my own, my sort of working theory is that, post 9/11, I think generally there was this trend where Hollywood went very quickly into a sort of return to 1970s style, kind of paranoid style filmmaking about world politics. And I think that, in a way, you could look at the success of the superhero movies as sort of... There was a lot of sort of bottled up, patriotic fervor, wanting to feel sort of good about America and go out and kick some ass after 9/11. And I feel like that sort of... that went away very quickly, and it especially went away very quickly in Hollywood, where George Bush became a hate figure faster than he became a hate figure in the rest of the country. And I think if you look at least some of these comic book movies, you can sort of see a desire to make a sort of old-fashioned archetypal Americans, a sort of John Wayne story, but without any of the complications of real-world politics. So, like the Spider-Man movies, Peter Parker is running around saving New York, saving post 9/11 New York over and over again. And I thought Iron Man, one of the things that was clever about it was the extent to which it sort of straddled the left-right divide, where on the one hand it was a critique of the military-industrial complex, but on the other hand he was out there killing Afghan terrorists and so on. So, I don't know, that's like my working sociological theory.
Still, the trend way predates 9/11. I mean, I agree with you that comes up in a very strange way in Iron Man, which sort of wants to have it both ways. It's an anti-war movie that ends up making this weapons dealer who can smash Afghani bad guys into the hero. So I never knew what that movie quite wanted to do politically. I think its allegorical aspirations are higher than what it can achieve. Still, what the superhero movie has become about, to me, at least this summer makes that very clear, is stunt casting. Who's the most introspective A-list actor you can find to sulk around in tights? And I have to admit that Robert Downey Jr. pretty much knocked it out of the park. And didn't sulk that much, was a refreshingly sort of acid wit and, very charming superhero.
But I think that's kind of actually becoming my biggest problem with the superhero book.
The stunt casting?
Well, not so much stunt casting, but the extent to which it seems like it's vacuuming up so many enormously talented people. And so, I was a huge fan of of both the Sam Raimi, who made sort of cult films like the Evil Dead, and I was also a huge fan of Raimi's A Simple Plan from the late 1990s, this sort of simple, bleak film noir.
Yeah, that's a very satisfying movie, made from a great pulpy book, by the way. But the movie succeeds very well.
It's the guy who also wrote The Ruins, right?
Right.
I've always meant to read it. But then, so Raimi has just spent, essentially like 8 years of his career now, this guy who I think is very talented, making Spider-Man movies. And the same thing is sort of true across the board. You have Bryan Singer, who started out with The Usual Suspects, who's just become Mr. Superhero, the X-Men movies, and then this what I thought was a pretty disastrous attempt to reboot the Superman franchise, and then the same thing with
Christopher Nolan, right?
Right, exactly. Who's and I mean Nolan sort of tried to move back and forth a little more between sort of superhero movies and I guess moderately artsier movies, but if this starts with directors and now that it's sort of, I mean, if we're reaching a point where Edward Norton and Robert Downey Jr. and all these people are they're obviously elevating the superhero movies, and again, I don't have any problem with like a good superhero movie from time to time. It just seems like a little much, and I'd like to see them doing something else.
Right. I mean, if you're going to tap into some over-quoted and overused vein of American pop culture, at least make it a different one, right? If they would even turn their attention to, the daily funny papers and start turning those guys into heroes or something. But it's got to be the actual fanboy comic book. It seems like it's getting really tapped out to me. Then again, with each new financially successful franchise, it's just going to go on and on.
Well, yeah, and I think that in that sense, I mean, I agree with you that it predates 9/11, but I think the sort of, normally these things, at least it seems to me, go in waves where you have a couple. I mean, you saw this with the Batman movies in the 90s. You had, I mean, I thought that the Tim Burton ones, especially the second one, were really fantastic. And then you had sort of diminishing returns with the Joel Schumacher versions, and then the whole thing felt kind of tapped out. And then we went for a decade without a Batman movie. And I think that that's more or less the way it should be. What worries me now is it seems like in the last 5 or 10 years, you see it with the Hulk. It's like, the first Hulk movie wasn't any good, but 5 years later they're back at it.
Right, the half-lives are getting shorter and shorter, which doesn't really speak to a promising future looking for original premises for summer blockbusters. The summer movie itself, this would be a whole other subject, but I mean the summer movie itself has just become such an incredibly bloated, this whole idea of the tent pole. I don't know if I've ever heard that word before 5 years ago or so, but the idea that the entire economy of the movie industry has to be set up, with 1 or 2 massive grossing summer movies for each studio.
Well, and yeah, I mean, people always trace this back to, to Steven Spielberg and George Lucas, but it is interesting that if you go back and look at, I feel like the blockbuster, sort of the original generation of blockbusters, in the 80s, especially the ones Spielberg and Lucas were involved in, there's such a cut above a lot of what's being released now, and there's certainly, I don't know, it just seems like there's a lot more. And again, this could just be sort of, I grew up in the 80s, of course you sort of think today's blockbusters can't match the blockbusters of your youth, but there does seem to be a sense in which people have sort of given up on trying to sort of create really interesting new properties. I mean, Indiana Jones was, in his original conception, was obviously a sort of refurbishing of these old pulp heroes from the 30s, but he was also sort of a new, interesting figure. And, it seems like you have less and less of that. Instead, you get Indiana Jones 4.
Although I have to say that for me, I keep on standing up for Indiana Jones in various formats, not because I think it's the greatest movie of all time, but I have to appreciate the craft and the imagination that went into that movie, and just to see an action blockbuster that's actually put together very cannily and just sort of performs its task very well. I have a soft spot for that particular hero. The guys in tights don't really do it for me. I never fantasized about wearing tights and flying in the sky, but being an archaeologist with a whip who recovers artifacts and saves the world, sure, I can go with that fantasy.
Yeah, I actually have not seen, and I don't intend to see the new Indiana Jones. And so
You're boycotting it?
Well, I was interested to read your review because it seemed like you were sort of critiquing the people who were critiquing Spielberg for sort of, going back to the well, right?
Right. I guess I was just laughing at them. It just seemed like the movie was a kind of a summer treat that I wasn't going to look a gift horse in the mouth. But maybe my expectations weren't quite so high. So.
Well, I think for me part of it too is just, again, to go back to my sort of Tolkien geekdom, I was also, I had Star Wars geekdom, and so I felt, me among millions of other geeks felt so burned by George Lucas revisiting the Star Wars movies and doing...
But George Lucas completely went off the deep end. I mean, the thing that Steven Spielberg turned out this summer, whether you liked it or not, is an actual movie, not one of those sort of strange filmed business conferences that were the late Star Wars movies.
Yeah, no, I guess I spent a fair amount of time reading about how, Lucas had vetoed the initial draft of the new Indiana Jones movie, and, I know sort of basic plot details. I know it includes space aliens, which seems to me to be kind of, well, I don't know. Having not seen it, I suppose I should take your word for it and bite the bullet. I just have...
It's got some Lucasian, you're right, it's got some Lucasian touches in there, but it still feels more like a Steven Spielberg movie to me, which is not to say that, I love everything Spielberg does, but I think that, he can pull off a hell of a well-made movie pretty much every time at this point. And it still feels more that way to me.
Yeah, but why? I guess my other question is, if you're Steven Spielberg, why would you do this movie? It's sort of, he's obviously, he clearly doesn't need the money at this point. And I just sort of, part of the last Indiana Jones film ended with them riding off into the sunset. There was a sense in which the original trilogy, and I liked Raiders of the Lost Ark much more than the second two, but it felt more like an organic whole. And, Harrison Ford is kind of old.
Yeah, nostalgia, I think, is probably, the only real reason. Nostalgia and a desire on the part of the fans for him to make one more.
That's true, and there are.
If you're going to start faulting everyone who makes a summer movie for their lack of originality and returning to a well, though, that's a really, really long list of targets right there.
Well, speaking of originality, we were going to talk a little bit about M. Night Shyamalan because I've one of the things that I've liked about M. Night Shyamalan in his career up until the last few years was that I felt like he was someone who was interested in making sort of, fun middle-brow movies that were original, that weren't just, he was a young director who wasn't going the Bryan Singer, Sam Raimi, Christopher Nolan route. He wasn't taking over other people's franchises. He wasn't doing comic book movies. He was trying to do interesting original work. And, what did you think of The Happening?
Well, I would just, before I even get to The Happening, I would just point out, though, that his lack of originality is a different kind of lack of originality. It's more of it's a sort of an obsession with homage, right, and with retro filmmaking, which he can do very cleverly and well. It's an interesting well to go back and tap, but it's also never when you're seeing an M. Night Shyamalan movie as if he's doing something completely new. It's completely different from anything else on screens right now, I'll give you that, but, he feels to me so indebted to Hitchcock and to, in this movie, George Carpenter, and to all kinds of, John Carpenter, sorry, and George Romero, and all kinds of sort of early horror movies. What did I think of The Happening? Failed movie, kind of absurd, full of unintentionally laughable moments, but I have to admit that it scared me. It made my palms sweat the whole time.
It did?
And,
okay, interesting.
He's one of those guys he's really got the knack. Unfortunately, his ideas never live up to his execution, in my view. Well, maybe one time, the first time, The Sixth Sense. I think that was sort of a, very nicely pulled off and cohesive horror movie that, the trick at the end completely worked. But he's gotten to be a pretty gimmicky one-trick pony. Then again, I'm always going to give him the chance. He's got to make 2 or 3 more bad movies before I give up on him entirely.
Okay, no, I'm in the same boat. I mean, I think we emailed about this before, and you thought, and I guess I agree that The Happening isn't as bad as Lady in the Water, which was just Lady in the Water was sort of a fascinatingly awful movie. I thought, like, it was clearly a movie that was sort of, he casts himself in a major role as a novelist who's going to save the world, and he made up a whole bizarre mythology involving narfs and other creatures with weird names.
It's a messianic, very, very strange messianic movie that evolved apparently out of a bedtime story he used to tell his daughters, which, is a perfectly fine origin for one's movie, but it didn't move far enough out from the bedtime story. Yeah, the poor kids, right?
Yeah, but I guess, The Happening, it felt like, I think to the extent that you could take it, it became more forgivable, and I think he said he wanted to make a B movie, and I think the movie feels more forgivable the more you treat it as sort of a failed attempt at an homage to Carpenter or Romero or whoever, or even to sort of the bad apocalyptic movies of the 1950s. But it also still has that sort of messianic feel where he wants to make just a fun B movie, but he also wants to make a movie that that's about like how we're destroying nature and the sort of heavy-handed environmental message that he sort of can't resist. I don't know. I thought Chris Orr did a piece about this for the for the New Republic, and he just sort of went down the list of absurdities. And anyone who doesn't want the end of the movie spoiled should stop watching right now. But the point of the movie is that the trees are trying to kill us because we've been mistreating trees for so long, and they need to the only way they can defend themselves is to secrete this pollen or this toxin that makes us kill ourselves. But then the movie ends. The trees. This is a temporary thing. It's a warning to us to mend our ways or something. And so it ends, and life basically just goes back to normal, and everybody starts arguing about what the tree's intention was or something. And Chris Orr.
No, but then there's a gotcha ending. Remember, there's one of those 50 sci-fi gotcha endings where the whole thing starts to happen again in Paris one day.
Right, in the Tuileries or something.
The Luxembourg Gardens, I think.
The Luxembourg Gardens, one of those places. But Chris was making the point that if this actually happened, like the first thing, people wouldn't sit around and be like, well, I wonder what the trees were trying to tell us. There would be like massive clear-cutting campaigns all across the United States. Anyway, I thought that was funny. But so
The Happening Part 2 could begin, right, with a completely barren planet. So in fact, the eco message that the trees tried to send would have to completely backfire.
Well, there was the Simpsons episode where it's Troy McClure announcing nature documentaries, and one of them is called Man vs. Nature: The Road to Victory. So that can be the Happening sequel. The thing with Shyamalan that I feel sort of let down because I was kind of an apologist for him. I think a lot of people got off. I agree with you that The Sixth Sense was his only completely successful film. I think a lot of people got off the bandwagon either at Signs or, people just hated The Village, I thought. And I liked Signs and I kind of liked The Village. I thought it was maybe a failed experiment in the end, but I thought it was a very interesting movie along the way. And so
it has a fabulous mood. What you're saying now is making me create a little counter theory about Shyamalan. I was never a big defender, but I am someone who always gives him the benefit of the doubt. And I think that he is a terrible writer of dialogue, but a great writer of stories. I think he has wonderful premises. The Sixth Sense is a wonderful premise. The Happening is a wonderful premise. And The Village is a wonderful premise. And he can even structure a story pretty convincingly. But what he can't do for the life of him is write dialogue. His dialogue is so stilted and so stiff, and that's what people laughed about in The Village. In The Sixth Sense, it happens to work because of this dead people, this dead people trick. I mean, of course, everybody's sort of speaking in a strange, stilted way with long pauses between the dialogue if they're dead, right? But it never really worked in any other movie for me.
It's true. I guess maybe I partially forgave it in The Village because I thought that just as they were dead in The Sixth Sense, the fact that in The Village they had sort of attempted to create this artificial, archaic world. It was the same thing. Well, of course, they're speaking in a stilted way because they're 20th century people faking being in, 1890s Pennsylvania. But
right. They're not dead, but they're deadened somehow to the world. So, if you can go with the premise, that can work. I mean, he also is a great creator of moods and sort of individual moments. He can really direct a scary sequence like nobody's business, even if he never quite incorporates it fully. If there's moments from The Sixth Sense, I still get scared just thinking about them. And the opening of The Happening, first 10 minutes, super scary.
Yeah,
right?
no. I mean, the premise of The Happening, the image of people, suddenly, randomly, en masse committing suicide is great. But I thought more than The Sixth Sense and some of his previous movies, I don't know. I just thought there was a lot more giggling, I thought, than there was sort of actual scares. But I don't know. I thought Mark Wahlberg just did not whatever. I think a movie like that. I thought actually what Mel Gibson did in Signs. I think you need an actor who can sort of sell your premise, and I thought Gibson is actually kind of good at that. Maybe because he's a little crazy himself. Whereas Wahlberg, as a science teacher, he just seemed to be wandering, sort of bemused through the Pennsylvania landscape.
Very miscast. That's one of the worst parts I've seen Wahlberg do, actually. I generally like him in almost everything he does, even if it isn't quite right, but he's not a Shyamalan hero. Yeah,
and the scenes where they're trying to outrun the wind, Dana.
Outrun the wind, if you can. Yeah, absolutely without logic as well, right? The very essence of something being a wind-borne toxin is you're breathing it in once it's in the air, right? So anyway, I'm ready to move on if you are from that one.
Okay, you've had enough. Well, so what else were we going to talk about? I guess there's also Sex in the City, which.
Oh, I'm so talked out about Sex in the City, but go ahead, take it, and I'll see if I can bounce it back.
Well, one thing that's sort of slightly askew to the subject of Sex in the City is the weird reaction in Hollywood to the movie doing really well. Because I woke up on, Monday morning or, after Tuesday morning, I guess maybe it came out Memorial Day weekend, and, it had done like 65 million. And for me, I was like, that box, that's probably a disappointment. They were probably hoping for like an $80 to $90 million opening weekend. And instead there were all these stories about how, once again, Hollywood is shocked that women actually go to the movies.
Yeah, I guess the shock was in proportion to, what they had projected for that weekend or how well so-called women's movies, romantic comedies have always done.
Yeah, I guess it was just, I went to see it on a Sunday of that weekend in the afternoon with my wife and some friends, and it was, it was like, to go back, it was Star Wars, it seemed like it was Star Wars for teen and 20-something women. This was like the movie theater in Georgetown in D.C., and it's a 2 p.m. show, and half the women in the audience seemed like they were dressed up as for New York nightlife.
Right.
It was like it was like people in a Wookiee costume, except it was people in a Charlotte costume.
I have to say that to me, there's something a little endearing about that when we just finished talking about superhero tent poles and how they've dominated the marketplace for God knows how many decades. And as absurd as it may be, the idea that there's a fantasy space where women can go act out their mass pop culture fantasies seems kind of nice to me.
Yeah, I guess I know you're a little talked out. I just want to sort of bounce.
I don't really have a defense for my affection for Sex and the City, the show or the movie, but I can't help it. I do have a soft spot for them.
Well, the reason, being a moralistic conservative scold, as you know from our exchanges about Knocked Up and abortion in the blogosphere, I'm obviously conditioned to dislike Sex and the City, but I did think that the show, I thought the show over the course of its run, it's sort of. Did you read the Candace Bushnell columns and the on which it's based for the book?
I don't think I ever read a one.
Yeah, I mean, you're not really missing out, but the columns are interesting because they strike a much darker tone than the show does. It's much more about, like, the sort of, there isn't the sort of core female friendship that's at the heart of the show. There's just these sort of isolated women drifting from one rancid or toxic bachelor to the next.
I like rancid. Let's have them rancid bachelors.
Rancid bachelors. But so the show, I mean, at first I thought, I really hated the show. I thought it was like this sort of, just like, sort of selling this myth of, like, sort of, sisterhood is the way to all these women who, kept having absolutely horrible experiences and being sort of, I guess Lee Siegel wrote a critique of Sex and the City for the New Republic. I don't know if you ever read that, but it just sort of talked about, like, the extent to which the show sort of exposed its characters to sort of serial humiliation, and then sort of acted as if it was all just fine and nobody was ever hurt by any of this. But I thought over the course of the show that changed, and it became a more, and I was a huge fan of the character of Miranda, especially. I thought there was, there ultimately ended up being a real human element in the show.
So the show won you over somewhat over the course of its run.
Yeah, and I thought
it's funny because I know David Edelstein in New York Magazine said something similar in his piece on the movie. He said he started off loathing the show, and then he found himself sort of ambivalently won over, and by the time it went off the air, he loved it. I don't know if he went quite that far, but
yeah,
maybe a lot of men watching it.
Maybe it's just
trajectory.
Stockholm syndrome. I sort of had to watch it, and with my then girlfriend, now wife. But I felt like the movies just sort of jettisoned a lot of what I sort of liked about the show by the end of it. And some of that, I think, was just that by necessity it had to be mainly about Carrie, who I thought was ultimately kind of the least interesting character. But just sort of the way, I don't know, it was just so, like, the sort of real estate as pornography, and, like, I don't know, the materialism and so on, and anyway, I don't know. Yeah,
I've never known how to balance my repulsion and the materialism of that show with my sort of liking of the characters and some of the storytelling, and just sort of the general world that the show establishes, just the sweetness of it. What does your wife think about that? Did she have to sort of drag you into watching it?
I think she maybe had something close to your take, which is I think she really liked the movie. I think and then we argued about it afterwards, and she was like, yeah, I see where you're coming from. I recognize your critique, but, like, fundamentally, I love the show, and it was nice to see it on the big screen. And so,
it's just sort of funny that it's funny that in the media reaction to the Sex and the City unexpected success, that it's almost as if women. I mean, I'm not going to speak for all women. Plenty of women obviously hate Sex and the City, but it has had a big response among female audiences. But there's this sense that you sort of have to apologize or defend your liking of the show or movie because they have these occasional terrible values espoused in them. But good Lord, I mean, let's just take a look at some of the male-marketed, boy-marketed, movies in which all kinds of mayhem is taking place. The idea that one has to apologize constantly for one's choice in a summer pleasure movie seems like a particularly female phenomenon this summer.
Yeah, I mean, although to be fair, like, well, I don't know. I mean, I guess you could get into it. It depends what. Yeah, I guess it depends how you rank different. There's sort of the horrible males. I mean, I'm being inarticulate here. I think the sort of male equivalent of the worst of the Sex and the City spirit is sort of the Maxim spirit. And I mean, I think a lot of, like, the sort of male-friendly blockbusters don't go that far. Like, you don't. I don't know. I feel like sort of the things I didn't like about Sex and the City would have been the equivalent of the message of Iron Man being that. The most important thing in life was just building really cool weapons, which is obviously kind of one of the points of Iron Man, but it also sort of makes, I don't know, it makes an effort to sort of undercut that, whereas...
Because you take your super weapon and you do the right thing with it.
Right. I mean, and I guess, you get the really nice shoes and you do the right thing with them. Maybe that's
I see what you're saying. There's not really any moral message to the shoes in Sex and the City. There's really not. It's just pure consumerist pleasure, and to tell you the truth, that part of it is kind of icky.
Yeah. Well, is there anything else we should discuss? I think we've covered a lot. Have there been any movies this summer that you really liked?
people always ask me that. It's sort of like the cocktail party question that you ask a movie critic. And, I've had trouble. I mean, everybody knows that Iron Man's fun and Robert Downey Jr.'s fun. I have to say that there hasn't been a single blockbuster yet that's blown me away. Maybe surprisingly much fun to be had at Sex and the City and even at Indiana Jones for me. I mean, there's been at least one smaller movie that I've liked that sort of, came and went very quickly. That Norwegian movie, Reprise. Did you see that?
I didn't know, but yeah, I heard.
It's worth catching. It's worth catching. It's a funny little sort of almost French New Wave indebted kind of very interesting little movie. I think the guy who made it, who's Lars von Trier's nephew, I believe, although he's Norwegian, is going to go on to do some interesting stuff.
Well, and what did you think? I just glanced at your review that Werner Herzog has a new...
oh, of course. So thanks for reminding me. Yeah, there's a new Werner Herzog documentary that I really liked, and I would recommend that. That doesn't feel like a summer movie to me, so I forgot it was even in the lineup. But it's called Journey to the End of the World, and it's a documentary about Antarctica. You've seen that one, right?
Yeah, I haven't seen it, but I intend. I'm a sort of not a huge Werner Herzog fan, but some of the things he does I really like. And
as I said in my review of it, it's no Grizzly Man, which to me is really a masterpiece of a documentary.
That is the sort of. I mean, that was sort of Grizzly Man was the perfect meeting of director and subject. It seemed
exactly.
Like
did you steal that from my review?
Did you? No. Herzog and the
exactly.
Yeah.
He found the perfect object, to sort of suit his sensibility, and he made a beautiful piece out of it. And, Journey to the End of the World is a little bit more of a run-of-the-mill documentary in terms of the form, but the content is fascinating. And as always, his documentary, I mean, his voiceover narration is weird and cool and smart, and definitely highly recommended.
Well, yeah, I don't, and for my part, I don't have. One reason I asked you is that I've seen fewer movies than you have. I've sort of confined myself to the blockbuster, and I don't have any really good recommendations. But the summer is only half over. Is there anything that you're really looking forward to?
It's all sort of in the blockbuster category. But yeah, I'm looking forward to Del Toro's Hellboy. I like the first one, and I think, talk about the meeting of director and material. I think if anybody could actually turn a comic book into something that feels really mythic and really archetypal, it's Del Toro, who did Pan's Labyrinth a couple of years ago, which is sort of like a child's nightmare come to life. So between Ron Perlman, Del Toro, and the material, I think that could be cool.
Well, good. Well, maybe we should.
What about you? What are you looking forward to?
I was trying to think, and I feel like. There are a bunch of movies I'm looking forward to, but I feel like they're all in the fall. It's like, they just released the trailer for The Curious Case of Benjamin Button with, did you see that trailer with Brad Pitt and Cate Blanchett and David Fincher directing?
Yeah, that's a good cast. It could be a good lineup.
But anyway, that's not that's not a big summer movie. I guess part of my I'm looking forward to The Dark Knight. I like the Batman movies out of the comic book pantheon. They're my favorite. I guess that's part of my disappointment with this summer is that it feels like a comic book summer, which isn't I sort of
Maybe when all the men in tights have gone their way, we'll meet again to talk about fall movies.
Sounds good. Well, it's been a pleasure talking to you, Dana.
Yeah, you too, Ross. Take care.
All right, take care.